Have you ever been playing a game and enjoying it thoroughly, only to get distracted by something admittedly more important than it, and then have a hard time getting back in? Well, there are tons of games I could mention. I'm just gonna throw the entire genre of RPGs in here because oftentimes their length conflicts with my schedule, leading me to drop a lot of games that I would otherwise enjoy. It didn't matter if the game was Final Fantasy, Xenoblade Chronicles, or Tales of title, I just couldn't manage to juggle doing important business stuff all the while playing games that average at about 45 hours of total playtime. And while I have learned to better manage my time now, back then, specifically when I was trying to edit the Kiwami 2 video, was a particularly hectic time, in which playing games outside of Kiwami 2 just seemed unfeasible, including one slightly longer than average action game called Judgment. Being the Ryoga Gotoko team's first game since Kiryu left the limelight, of course I wanted to see for my own 2 games how good it was, but the timing was just awful as I got slammed by admittedly self-inflicted work that I had to drop to focus on other things like the Kiwami 2 video. At the time I was incredibly tired and associated those emotions with Judgment, which in turn, with it being longer than the average Yakuza game, I wasn't too excited to dive back in. But then its sequel Lost Judgment got announced, and as the days ticked down to its release, I decided to play it again. But from where I left off, because I did this dance way too many times with RPGs to tell you restarting will only get me to stop in the exact same place. And as I finished Judgment, I realized a few things, in that not only was it super fun, but it was also probably the best narrative told in an RPG game that I've covered yet. By the time the credits rolled, I was floored, as not only did the RGG team stick a landing in their first game without Kiryu, but in my opinion, they got an almost perfect score to boot. I say almost as there are a handful of things that could have been better, but overall, this is one of their best titles yet, and I want to talk about it. So strap right in, because we're diving right into Judgment. Our story begins after a court case where our protagonist, Takayuki Yagami, has just won his first big case as a defense attorney, getting an alleged murderer by the name of Shinpei Okubo off the hook in a country that has a 99% conviction rate. Of course, thanks to the defeat, Yagami starts swimming in jobs from people who want to hire him as their new defense attorney. However, one of those new clients happens to be Shinpei Okubo, much to Yagami's confusion. Apparently, in the time it took for Okubo to be released, he was convicted of another murder, this time for his girlfriend Emi, whose body ended up burning alongside their apartment. The loss of Emi cuts deep for Yagami, as we then cut to 3 years later in the familiar streets of Kamurocho, where Yagami has now become a private eye, and is now on a stakeout mission with his partner Masaharu Kaito to track down a fellow detective who's late on paying his dues. While the two muscle the money out of him, the detective tries to scare Yagami by threatening him with a lawsuit for damages, but Yagami plays the Uno reverse card, showing his lawyer pin, telling the man that if he tries to fight him in the court, he'll lose. While Kiryu may be gone, Kamurocho is still the same, with crime happening under every street lamp and brand new gangs popping out of the woodwork that the police aren't able to stop. However, in the cold dark alleyways, something sinister is brewing, as the cops encounter the third victim of a serial murderer who goes around gouging the eyes out of his victims. Aside from the fact that his victims have been Kansai Yakuza known as the Kure clan that's currently squatting in Kamurocho, nothing is known about the killer, leaving the cops with another dead end for the time being. We then cut back to Yagami and Kaito on their way back from their job, when Yagami suggests he hit up his former stomping ground, Genna's Law Office, for any job listings. But before he leaves, Kaito suggests he buys his former boss a gift, even handing him some of his own earnings to do so. On his way to the convenience store, Yagami runs into the client of his last job, Hamura, the captain of the Matsugane family, who takes the liberty of painting himself as a villain, bringing up Yagami's troubled past as a lawyer, to which, after he gets under his skin, he then splits from the scene. At Genda's, Yagami arrives for a quick hi, but Genda keeps him around for a while longer, asking him to come back and work for his firm, to which Yagami quickly shuts him down, saying that after the Okubo incident, he no longer trusts his eyes to judge right from wrong. Thanks to Yagami holding a self-pity party, Genda switches gears, offering a job of collecting evidence for a divorce case, when suddenly another lawyer in the office named Sayori Shirosaki says to Yagami that she has a different job lined up for him, and tells him to meet a senior Shintani at a bar named Tender for more info. When Yagami heads down to tender, Shintani tells him that he was just approached by the Matsugane to defend Hamura in court. As thanks to security cam footage, he was caught shoving the Kyorei clan member who got his eyes gouged out that night into his bar, putting him under suspicion of murder. From Shintani, Yagami learns that the murder charge is a bit spotty, as with the victim being one of 3 people who got their eyes gouged out, this clearly points to the work of a serial killer. However, the cops think that this might be the Tojo's method of sending a message to the Kyorei to get off their turf, but with no solid evidence to back the cops' claims up, it's all just conjecture, leading Yagami and Shintani to pay Hamura a visit down at the station to get more info. Despite Hamura claiming to be innocent, he does everything in his power to paint himself as shady as possible, blowing up at simple questions like, "Did you do it?" Hamura's attitude gets under Yagami's skin, to the point where he threatens that if he finds any reason to doubt his innocence, he'll head straight to the prosecution to help them instead, not wanting to repeat the Yokobo incident and let another murderer run free. Ultimately, the two find out that on the day of the murder, while Hamura did pull the victim into one of the family's clubs and roughed him up, he split from the place right before midnight and spent the rest of the night in the sauna on the east side of Kamurocho. With that, Yagami goes on his way to see if Hamura's alibi holds any water, even going so far as to infiltrate the Kyorei clan's stronghold in Kamurocho, KJR, and see what their side of the story is. Yagami ends up finding a lot, with one of those things being that Hamura was telling the truth, as he managed to find a host that would corroborate his story, as Hamura ended up slugging the guy in his mouth on his way to the sauna. However, that wasn't the only thing Yagami found, as thanks to Murase of the Kyorei clan, who told him that he and some other members of the clan rallied together to get their boy back. However, as they arrived at the club mere minutes before Hamura claimed to have left, they found that not a soul was there. And thanks to new security cam footage that was released right before the trial, it showed that Hamura had tossed out both his subordinates and the staff of the club, but stayed behind with the victim. It's clear that something fishy is up, causing Yagami to deduce that Hamura handed the victim over to the killer, who he decides to call the Mole thanks to his tendency to drill out his victim's eyes and retreat into the shadows. But thanks to Hamura making a fool out of him, Yagami sets his sight on the both of them, looking to bring the light of justice to the creatures that stalk in the darkness. This was just the first chapter of Judgment, and while I shortened it down greatly, believe you me when I tell you that this was probably the meatiest intro in an RPG game, and it honestly needed it. While the setting may be the same, we're running with a brand new cast of characters with different motivations, backgrounds, and friendships, all of which need to be properly spaced out so that any of the later twists and turns have a chance to actually leave an impact. Now, of course, one of the biggest aspects the game tries to sell us is on Yagami, as the game constantly flashes aspects of his personality both inside and out of cutscenes. For example, if you break a throw with Yagami, he'll take the time to taunt the enemy. Whenever Yagami talks to someone, he's more than likely to play along with the person's ridiculous request rather than just being the straight man, although he's not opposed to acting like one, and Yagami actually smiles. While this may be his first game, I'd say that Yagami is a more believable character than Kiryu. While Kiryu unquestionably has better development, mostly because his games are over and took the time to flesh out his character to his maximum potential, there were times when playing past Yakuza games that it felt that some of Kiryu's responses were more so of him filling out a role rather than an organic interaction. But with Yagami, everything he does feels so natural to his character that it ends up coming off as more realistic. Sometimes when there's some Yakuza stuff happening, Yagami is the last person to react. Sometimes when Kaito or someone else pulls off a cool maneuver, he sits there like a deer in headlights. That doesn't mean that Yagami doesn't have any cool moments, as the game is chock full of them, but he's slow because he's not used to some of these scenarios, so he just gets caught off guard. But I also feel that makes his cool moments stand out even more, as it feels that an underdog is punching up against a system bigger than him, while in Kiryu's case, he was clearly the overdog in almost every fight he was in. Now, the coolest part about this is the fact that Yagami's personality also manages to shine in the combat of Judgment, or more specifically, Yagami's fighting style. Where Kiryu was the equivalent of an army tank with legs, in which despite being trained, his overwhelming power was arguably his most defining trait, Yagami is the exact opposite of this, as he uses his knowledge of fights to cover up for his lack of strength. When you look at Yagami's attacks, they're more calculated and graceful in comparison to Kiryu's, so while he may not look as powerful, you know he's cooking something big up underneath all of these strikes. What's also cool about Yagami's lack of strength is that it causes him to make more use of the environment around him, which comes in the form of wall strikes, as by running up to a wall, Yagami will then kick off it and then use the added momentum to strike the opponent, or when running at someone, will use his body weight to flip them over. I haven't gone into the finer details of the combat in Judgment, but these few changes so far make me appreciate how different Yagami is from Kiryu. and really from every other Yakuza character before him, with the exception of Tanimura. But even in that case, I'd still say that Yagami's fighting style is better, as not only is it more visually apparent that he was trained, but he's much more manageable in terms of combat speed, which puts him leaps and bounds over the cop. Speaking of the combat, Judgment adds in a couple of beloved mechanics that the fans have missed since they were introduced, being styles. So unlike Kiryu, Yagami only has 2 styles to his name, the first of which is Crane, which is used to deal with crowds thanks to its wide sweeping kicks, and Tiger, which is better for single target use, having better damage and armor frames. While both styles are good and do their jobs well, I feel that they're a little too specific in the instances that they can be used in. As I already mentioned, Crane is meant to be used in crowds thanks to its wide sweeping kicks. However, we're still playing off of 6's combat system, where if an enemy blocks you, you'll go flying back, which already is a big enough pain when trying to use Crane in the instances it's meant to be used in. But when you take this information and apply it into a boss fight, in which most bosses will just block you whenever you try to attack, the style becomes nearly useless without a crowd present. On the opposite side of the coin, Tiger constantly inflicts guard break on every string, ignoring the pushback you normally suffer, so in the example I gave a second ago, you can switch to Tiger to deal with them. However, the AI's aggressiveness has also been amped up for Judgment, so while you can tank through their hits, your health bar is going to be worse for wear, in which case you want to use Crane to get rid of the crowd, but since we're still in the boss fight example, the problem just keeps looping on itself. Throughout playing Judgment, it felt like I couldn't find a middle ground between the 2 styles outside of story events, as when you encounter random enemies, there's some weird registration going on where, despite being open to attacks, the game acts like they're blocking, and if you're using Crane, you physically can't get past this, as the recovery you suffered from getting your attack block opens you up to a free hit. As a result, I normally started encounters in Tiger, since despite the fact that it also suffered the same problem, you can immediately cancel it into one of your armor attacks to bypass it. Speaking of Tiger, I found that, as a whole, it's a much more fun style to mess around with, as the quick step cancel I mentioned back in Yakuza 6 is still applicable in this style, and combined with the new wall jump and leapfrog moves, they can allow you to clown your opponents like never before. If you're wondering if Crane gets something similar, you're unfortunately mistaken, as if you try to do the same technique, Yagami will perform a dodge roll instead, ending the combo outright. As a result, it leads Crane to be extremely vanilla in terms of how you use it, at least in comparison to Tiger. However, if you really want to change things up, Judgment introduces extracts, which acts as a substitute for weapons, as while Yagami can pick up weapons off of the street corner, he cannot carry them around with him post-fight. Extracts are temporary buffs that you can give Yagami to change the properties of his attacks, how the circle button functions, how often he can stun the enemy, and much more. You can make extracts by gathering items scattered all over Kamurocho streets and mixing them into a gourd given to you by a man named Ayama, or by buying it from him, which is much faster, but super freaking expensive in comparison. And to add insult to injury, the buffs only last around 20 or so seconds, which is enough to get you past a random encounter, but not much to really experiment with how it flows with the combat system as a whole. While extracts can change things up from the base combat and make things interesting, the cost to use them for a short period of time is oftentimes not worth going out of my way to get. As a result, I view extracts like a power-up in an old school beat-em-up game, where if I have it, I'll use it, and if I don't, I'm having fun with the combat anyways, so I don't mind. Now, in addition to extracts, Judgment has a couple new shiny objects in the game, the first of which being the EX gauge. On the surface, the EX gauge functions similarly to heat, with the exception being that no matter how many times you're hit, it will never drain.
While this seems like a cool buff that the EX gauge has, you'll soon realize that it's an absolute necessity that it never drain, as the EX gauge not only serves as your main source of offense in boss fights, but it also doubles as your major defensive tool as well.
New to Judgment is Mortal Wounds, in which case whenever a boss starts emitting their aura and gets ready to do their special attack, or has a gun, their attack will seal off a portion of your health bar in addition to hurting you, preventing you from healing to 100%. To avoid the health seal, you have to be in EX mode, which functions like extreme heat mode, including the part where the more damage you take, the more meter you lose, so oftentimes you won't get much use out of it if you try to perform a combo. Instead, immediately using an EX action is the way to go,
as performing one will automatically skip their big attack and reset them to a less aggro state. Although, with that being said, you should still be in EX mode when you do this, just in case you get the timing wrong and get 25% of your health sealed off.
This may sound like an understatement, but getting hit by a mortal wound sucks, as not only are you locked out of your health for the rest of the fight, but the mortal wound follows you outside of battle as well, and will stick with you until the end of the chapter. Now, there is a way to get rid of mortal wounds faster by either visiting a doctor in the sewers who will heal you for a price, or you can buy items from him just in case you run into problems later on. While I mentioned in the past how important maintaining your heat was and expressed a lot of joy in the decision making going behind holding onto your heat, I'm not a fan of how much more necessary judgment makes the EX gauge, as there's no decision to be made. Either you save it for a boss and wait for them to get to this point in a fight, or get mollywopped simply for not having meter. And while you could just hoard all the meter until you get to a boss, there's another issue where, unless you've been playing this game a lot, you won't always know where a boss is, and sometimes the game will throw multiple bosses at you, so at some point you will run into this scenario. It also doesn't help that the EX gauge has the slowest meter generation in any RPG game I've played, with upgrades for it only becoming present at around the 5th chapter of the game. So if you choose to hoard meter, you'll find yourself missing out on some of the best parts of the game for a long period of time. Now, there is a way around all of this by using the tried and true items to boost the EX gauge to where it needs to be. There's just one issue. You don't have many items to do that with. Ever since Yakuza 6, the RGG team have been doing their best to scale back on how many heat recovery items you can carry with you into battle, at first limiting them to 10, and now reducing that number to a whopping 3. While no official statement was given, I assume the reason was because of how easy it was to dodge past heat's inherent restriction by just loading up your inventory with heat recovery items. Because of their limitations, I'd say it's best to make absolutely sure that the situation you're in is one that can be solved with an item. This goes for healing items as well, as the money in Judgment is simultaneously difficult and easy to come by. So in Judgment, despite Yagami being an avid pocket pilferer, the rewards you get from defeating random foes like gold plates are scaled back quite a bit from what they used to be, making your street earnings to be pretty meager all things considered.
This is what I meant when I said that money is hard to come by in Judgment, as random battles were, at least for me, a good chunk of where my spending money came from in past RGG games. And without it, it causes random battles to feel a bit more like a hindrance, as without Yagami compensating himself monetarily, the only reason I have to fight random enemies is to grind EXP or just because I like the combat. Which, don't get me wrong, I do like the combat system and I want to grind for EXP, I just want the money to be there like it used to. Thankfully, money is never far from you in Judgment, as by simply looking at your bulletin board in your office, talking to Sayori, or talking to the bartender at, well, Tender, you will gain access to side cases, Judgment's version of sub-stories, where by completing one, you will be compensated for it. Although it should be noted that this isn't true for side cases you find on the street, as you'll simply gain experience. Now, aside from these side cases being super funny as per usual, you will also have the chance of being introduced to a handful of mini-games in the form of lockpicking, inspecting, and tailing.
These 3 mini-games are alright in their own regard and give quite a bit of insight on how Yagami's life as a detective works. Tailing, however, is probably the one mini-game that I could have done without. It's not bad per se, but it can be extremely long as you follow your target all around Kamurocho as they move at a snail's pace, occasionally looking back to see if someone's following them. These mini-games are probably the only thing in Judgment that can single-handedly put me to sleep, as there's hardly anything interesting going on to break up the long spells of nothing happening on screen. Also, the tailing sections are an auditory annoyance thanks to the intense track that will play when you lost sight of your target, in which case the track will keep playing until you relocate them again. While this isn't so bad in a vacuum, the problem occurs with how fast and how consistent the song will play when you briefly take your eyes off the target, in which passing through a series of columns will set the song off like no tomorrow, turning a small musical cue into what is probably my least liked aspect of the game. Thankfully though, with all this travel, you'll be given multiple opportunities to run through good old Kamurocho again, which has gotten a few changes to help show how it's adapting to the modern age. First off, the Rise Up Gym is gone, and its place being a VR center which, by completing what are in essence a board game, you'll be rewarded in a lot of money. The VR center is, in actuality, the best place in Judgment to rake in the dough. However, it's not consistent, as you need a play pass to enter, or need a free voucher, which will eat up your time instead of money trying to get one. Strangely enough, Millennium Tower has now become an interactable location where you can complete in drone races which are alright. Honestly, didn't spend too much time here, so I couldn't really tell you much about it, but it is here and does control well for racers, so there is that. But while all these changes are fun to mess around with, what interested me the most were the changes made to the citizens. So, in Judgment, Yagami has a reputation to uphold with the citizens of Kamurocho, represented by your reputation level. While there are a number of different factors that play into whether or not you receive side cases, your reputation is oftentimes going to be your biggest wall. As to increase your rep, you'll need to interact with a citizen of Kamurocho until you become their friend, indicated by their icon on the map turning from white to green. It should be noted that every time you interact with one of your friends before their front quest is complete, they'll gain 50 SP, the experience points of this game, per interaction. As a result, both side cases and front quests serve as your primary methods on leveling up Yagami, and honestly, I'm pretty down for it. RGG games in the past have done even more than I can realize to get the player to explore the city of Kamurocho. While it started with adding interesting side quests, it evolved into making each restaurant you visit more important to leveling up Kiryu. However, I imagine this didn't go as planned since certain restaurants have bigger value food items than others, making it easy to game the system and take out the human element the team were hoping to put in. Should be noted that food still gives you experience points, albeit it's pretty meager, sitting at a whopping 20 SP per food item. It may not be much, but thanks to there being a lot of food items and a lot of restaurants in Kamurocho, eating out is actually not a bad idea to SP grind. In fact, I'd honestly recommend it over using any of your healing items, as considering how limited they all are, I'd say it's best to keep them in your back pocket and shovel food in from any and all places. It also helps that most restaurants can also have someone that can become Yagami's friend, so really you're just hitting two birds with one stone with this method. Once you fully become friends with the person, certain friends will help you out when you throw down in a street fight, while others will simply say hi when you pass them on the street, and if you slow down and wave to them, it'll increase your EX gauge.
I think.
So yes, the EX gauge does increase, but it's by such a small amount you won't notice it in the short or long run. If you want to get the EX gauge moving faster, there are a number of different things you can do in Kamurocho, like smoking in designated areas or getting poked and prodded by acupuncture needles. You know, with all these new inclusions, Judgment feels like a life simulator, where whenever you're not in a story event, you feel like you're plopped in a day in Yagami's life, complete with remembering which keys on your key ring open the door to your apartment. While you could say that this was also a thing for Kiryu, it was never as detailed as it is now with Yagami, as you can control a surprising breadth of his dialogue options with a very limited success rate, mind you, and can even decide what lady he'll date, although this is probably the aspect of the game I interacted with the least, mostly because the girl I was interested in dating in Judgment wasn't one that you could date through this minigame, so I left most of the girls I'm right a majority of the time. However, going back to the EX gauge, the best method to build the EX meter is an old reliable method that's been present in RGG games for a long time now, and to access it, you need a bottle of Jack Daniels.
Alcohol in RGG games has, to my knowledge, always given you an extreme boost to heat generation, and in Judgment, it's no different. Now, despite knowing this for the longest time, I never actually used any drinks when playing an RGG game, as normally the heat generation was more than good enough to the point where I didn't need to use it. But with the EX gauge being so pivotal towards defense, and items that refill the EX gauge being so limited, I figured why not, hoping to spice things up. And boy was it spicy. Yagami while intoxicated is so much more fun to control than when he's sober. In fact, getting Smash Face will make your meter so uncontrollably good you won't have enough options to spend it on before the drink works its way out of Yagami's system. And because of this, Yagami becomes way more explosive in terms of combat ability, allowing you to wax any opponent with ease. Now, I say options, but in truth, Yagami doesn't have too many moves to his name. But having the ability to use EX mode as an offensive weapon, as well as being able to use it defensively at your own will, is so liberating that the combat system suddenly jumps to life in the aggressive fashion that I'm more used to with these games. Although, with that being said, Yagami may need that drink for something else, as the combat in Judgment has an unfortunate blemish in the form of the Keihin gang. Long story short, thanks to Yagami interfering with some thugs in Kamurocho, he got a bunch of gangsters to come after him for revenge. How this translates to gameplay is that at random intervals you'll get a text from your friend Mr. Kim that tells you that the Keihin gang are in Kamurocho and looking for you. And as a result, the amount of random encounters you'll get is significantly increased until the threat percentage located in the upper right corner of the screen reaches 0 by beating up every thug that comes across your path, or by taking out the leaders of the Keihin gang. And while by itself that's not so bad, the 4 leaders of the Keihin gang occupy 4 different areas of Kamurocho, meaning that you're gonna have to be putting in a lot of legwork to get to them, which in turn sets you up to deal with the increased encounter rate, in which when you beat one encounter, you might find that the next encounter spawns right next to you, giving you no time to breathe. Now, I'm pretty sure you've all been able to tell by now, but I really like combat in video games and diving as far deep into a combat system as I can and or care to do. With that being said, I like to think of myself as pretty patient when it comes to gameplay. However, even then, I couldn't help but find the Keihin gang to be very tedious to fight. Not only because it takes a while to mow through them, but because of how consistently they appear after they're first introduced. In my mind, if the Keihin gang were a side case that you can just choose whether or not to opt in, they wouldn't be so bad. But because they randomly appear in the overworld, oftentimes you're forced to deal with them, which makes them a huge pain. Now, even though I said all of that, you got a couple of methods of ignoring the Keihin gang, as if you activate a minigame or sub-story that has no access to the overworld, their threat percentage still ticks down, allowing you to waste their time. However, there is a silver lining to fighting the Keihin leaders, as their boss themes are great, with Koga's theme Showdown being a standout among the rest, as Judgment ended up taking those techno pieces Six messed with and embraced it entirely. There are so many techno bops present in Judgment, but Showdown is the one that stuck out the most in my memory, in one part because it's a really good song, and in the other part because this was the fight I realized that bullets are an automatic mortal wound. The next song I want to bring mention to is The Flower of Chivalry, another boss theme that fits the character it plays for super well, as the song starts out being kinda quiet and timid, but as it continues it grows in confidence, adding more and more instruments into the mix until it explodes into a beautiful guitar solo. Also, something interesting I noticed is that characters who subscribe to the mentality of the previous Yakuza games, being things like pride, loyalty, and so on, got guitar pieces, while characters who implemented new ways of thinking got techno pieces. It's pretty neat to hear that the differences between these two ideologies now go beyond the characters and further paint how estranged these mentalities are from one another. The last track I wanted to bring mention to is Inharmonic, an overworld theme that sets the mood for Judgment as a whole, being a mysterious and foreboding track that uses its instruments to create an uncomfortable vibe that makes you unsure if the path forward is safe. But then the other instruments kick in, letting you know that even if it's not safe, it's the path that leads to truth, so no matter what, you can't back down now. It's actually fitting that I mentioned that, seeing as I run out of things to talk about gameplay-wise, and now I'll do what I normally do and head back into the story. But before I do, I want to bring mentions of something that's been missing from the series ever since Yakuza 1 back in 2005, being the English dub. Now, I have not listened to Yakuza 1 as of writing this, but I have listened to the voice acting via YouTube clips, and it's, not great to put it lightly.
Just what the fuck family are you from, huh?
Excuse me.
Excuse you? No. Fuck you.
I couldn't tell you whether or not the success of Yakuza 1 led to the dub being pulled for every subsequent game, but what I can tell you was that for the longest period of time, these games were released in the West being fully voiced in Japanese with English subtitles to help the Western audiences understand what's going on. And while that was totally fine, I mean, I got into the series with it being so subtitle heavy and enjoyed it greatly, the difference in reading subtitles versus listening to a dialogue in your own native language is night and day. Some jokes land a lot harder harder when you don't read the punchline before the character can say the punchline. It also helps that certain scenes were rewritten to better fit the English language, not to mention that the lips for the characters have been completely resynced to match the English voice cast, which, by the way, is also aces. Greg Chun, Cher Lee, Steve Bloom are just some of the VAs on this game, and all of them knock it out of the park. But the one voice actor on the English side that caught my attention was Crispin Freeman as Kaito. Now, I watched a lot of Naruto when I was a child, so I attribute a lot of actors from that show from the English side with my childhood, and Crispin Freeman's performance as Itachi was no exception. So you can imagine the look on my face when I heard Kaito's voice being a gruffer Itachi who swears up and down the street. And you know what? It absolutely works. Crispin Freeman delivers all of Kaito's lines with a shocking amount of gusto that makes it hard not to like him, and even harder not to laugh at some of the things he says.
Nice going, Talk. You look weak as shit out there. You're like a baby sheep or something. How are you even doing that?
Can you not? This is how I always walk.
Now, with that being said, let's get back into the story and wrap that up as well. The narrative begins to kick things into high gear when Hamura catches wind of Yagami's attempts to shed light on the mole and attempts to snuff him out. Except not really. But thanks to a masked man helping him Tony Hawk his way out of Hamura's clutches, he's able to continue on with his investigation without worry. Eventually, Yagami's investigation puts him on the trail of an old robbery case that cost Kaito his role in the Matsugane, as he was a man on watch when the place got robbed blind. Thanks to Kaito's shady info broker, Ayabe, who looks like he's supposed to be a Date stand-in, but is actually one for the florist, Yagami is led to Higashi, a high-ranking member of the Matsugane. After beating the information out of Higashi, he reveals that last year he was actually in the office when the robbery went down, but thanks to Kaito giving up prematurely, Higashi was saved from having to kill someone. Wanting to repay his kindness, Higashi approached Ayabe for information on the robber, who we later learned was named Red Nose, and scoured the entire city for him, eventually finding himself in the sewers where not only found Red Nose, but Hamura alongside him. Thanks to some clumsy footwork, Higashi alerts Hamura to his presence, which gets the captain to shoot Red Nose immediately. He then aims his gun at Higashi, but is only stopped by one of his subordinates telling him that it'd be too suspicious if he disappeared as well. With that, Hamura asks Higashi how he found out about Red Nose, which gets Higashi to spill the beans. And after listening to what he had to say, Hamura has Higashi swear loyalty to him and prove it by shooting Red Nose's dead body. Despite not wanting to let Hamura get away with it, Higashi's actions left him as the primary suspect behind Red Nose's death, as thanks to his feverish search around Kamurocho, in which all the citizens knew that he was after Red Nose, and with his hands being on the murder weapon, there was nothing Higashi could do as the Matsugane family fell into Hamura's hands. That's right, the Matsugane family don't take orders from their patriarch, as thanks to Hamura bankrolling them, the family as a whole is much more partial to their captain. With no more information to pump out of Higashi, Yagami leaves the arcade, allowing Kaito to catch up with an old friend. During their conversation, Higashi states that he's not sure why, but there's something about Yagami that he just can't stand, which somehow gets Kaito to tell Yagami's whole backstory. To make a long story short, Yagami's father was a defense attorney similar to his son, and a pretty good one too. One day, however, he managed to get the acquittal for a murder suspect, which didn't go over too well with one of the victim's relatives, as he paid Yagami's father a visit to kill him, his wife, and himself all at once. Seeing this broke something in Yagami, as he would soon find himself working a job in Tender where he'd pick fights with Kaito whenever he showed up. Naturally, due to Yagami being a teenager at the time, he got smoked whenever he tried to challenge Kaito. However, his losses never deterred him, as he just kept coming night after night. One day, however, Matsugane would be traveling alongside Kaito and see the boy he beat up in the street, and offered him a way out of the hole that he was currently in with no strings attached, which is what led Yagami to become a lawyer. It's never explicitly stated, but the death of Yagami's parents left a huge scar on his mind, which we don't get to see until, the beginning of the game when Emi dies. Thanks to Yagami more or less recreating one of the worst moments in his life, he's traumatized by his actions to the point where he quits being a lawyer altogether. Because a defense attorney's job isn't to prove one's innocence but to cast doubt on the plaintiff's case, he views his past work as shoddy at best, and as a result, he's become scared of himself. Despite the fact that Yagami at no point cowers at the sight of his own shadow, he is extremely aware of how his judgment as a lawyer can affect those around him, which is why now he feverishly works to make sure that he knows the truth before he makes any move. While this does have the unexpected benefit of making him a living beacon of justice, it also makes Yagami extremely slow in the uptake, as even in situations where his closest friends are telling him that something in the case makes sense, he refuses to believe it until he can prove that it's 100% true, which does serve as his character flaw throughout Judgment's narrative. The theme of trauma doesn't just stop at Yagami, as in fact, the main enemy faction uses trauma as a fuel to justify their actions, and with it, asks a lot of really interesting questions. For instance, is it right if a person is sacrificing innocent lives, who may have a scuffed history, for something potentially beneficial for all of mankind that may not even come to pass? Is it right to bend the law to your own needs and not care if anyone else gets crushed by your ambitions? Is it right to turn a blind eye to a killer who promises with one death he can save millions? Or rather, as I should put it, is it right to do something good instead of doing what is right? Anyways, while the situation may seem bad, it's actually about to take a turn for the better, in a sense. As with the Kyorei knowing that Hamura had something to do with the murder of Kume, they managed to scare him off by sending an assassin to the Matsugane who ended up murdering a family member with the same build and jacket as Hamura. Despite the fact that the assassin missed his target, it got the message through to Hamura, causing him to go into hiding. With Hamura's presence gone, it allows Higashi to, reluctantly, use his arcade Charles as Yagami's home away from home, being a good place to hide from any watchful eyes when any Yakuza are on the prowl. And Charles gets some use almost immediately, as when Yagami and Kaito go to the Kyorei to check on their operations to see if they know anything more about Hamura, they manage to get ambushed by the Kyorei Clapton. What the heck did I just say? Chiyoya, who's actually looking to jump the Matsugane family seeing as they killed one of their members, but will gladly take Yagami's head instead. Thanks to the masked man saving him again, Yagami and Kaito are able to free themselves and beat Chiyoya, but considering that they're so close to the Kyorei family's base, they decide to run back to Charles for the night. Once there, the masked man introduces himself as Sugiura and explains that he used to be an employee for a construction tycoon named Kajiura, doing a bunch of IT work for his company, until one day he found an account book with a large sum of money being funneled into Kamurocho. After following a couple of trails, he realized that the money was going to the Kyorei clan, but before he can get the information out to anyone, he was fired, framed for embezzling money, and thrown out on the streets. And now, he hangs around their shell company, KJR, looking for the evidence he needs to clear his name, and just so happened to see Yagami in trouble. Sugiura then mentions that he wants to join Yagami, after getting some time to think it over, as with his goal of clearing his name, and Yagami's goal of finding the mole, there seems to be a bit of overlap in where they need to look. So for the time being, Sugiura suggests that they scratch each other's backs until they can get what they want. From there, Higashi gets a bit worried, as thanks to Shintani being the lawyer that freed Hamura, he tells Yagami to give him a warning, as an attempt can be easily made on his life just like it was on Hamura's. However, when Yagami gets down to Genda's, he not only finds Shintani, but he finds his new inflated ego alongside him. Thanks to his face being the one that the public saw when Hamura was set free, Shintani's been rolling in job requests, so much so that he doesn't even want to listen to Yagami's warning, instead telling him that Hamura wants him to stop investigating the mole. Yagami replies by saying while they technically did their jobs back at the courthouse, our murderer is still on the loose and won't rest until he's brought to justice. Shintani doesn't take too well to Yagami talking down to him, as he says on his way out that the mole is way bigger than any Yakuza pissing contest. This clues everyone in the office that Hamura told Shintani something, but thanks to attorney-client privilege, Shintani refuses to speak any more on the matter, leaving Yagami with a heaping bowl of nothing to go off of. It's a long day after that for Yagami, filled with tailing missions and Captain Cop, so of course he decides to wind down in his office, but thanks to a call from Sayori, that rest isn't gonna come too soon, as when Yagami answers the phone, she tells him that ever since Shintani left the office, she's been unable to contact him, and hopes that he can get through for her. Despite their earlier friction, Yagami gives it a whirl, only to hear a ringtone come from his closet. As Yagami inches closer to the door, Shintani's body falls out of it with his eyes gouged out. Yagami then calls Sayori, telling her to call the cops as he just found Shintani's body. However, he doesn't want to report this in himself as he wants time to inspect the corpse. While the body is fresh out of blood, indicating that the murder didn't happen here, Yagami did manage to find Shintani's phone with a number of calls made to Genda's office, and the very last number he called being unregistered to his phone. phone. As soon as Yagami can take a picture for the evidence, the police arrive with Kuroiwa heading to dispatch, starting things off by accusing Yagami of murdering Shintani before kicking him out of his office, as forensics will need to shut the whole place down to do their job. As a result, Yagami decides to crash on Genda's couch as the old defense attorney laments the loss of Shintani. Genda then focuses his attention on Yagami saying to lay low and leaves the city if need be, as if he lost him too, he wouldn't know what to do with himself. Yagami politely listens to Genda before secretly ignoring him, as he's then approached by Genda's new attorney Hoshino, who offers to give him a helping hand in catching the mole. Hoshino reveals that he regrets not ever trying to help out Shintani, saying that the tough guy act that Yagami saw him in last was a front to help him put up with the Yakuza, but he wants to make up for his past hesitation by helping Yagami catch the mole. With that, Hoshino immediately puts himself to use by using his powers over Google search to find out that the last number Shintani called belonged to the Advanced Drug Development Center, or the ADDC for short, the same hospital where Okubo, Yagami's client from the beginning of the game, allegedly killed Waku. So the next day, Hoshino does his homework and finds out that, thanks to a man named Kido, a miracle drug that'll cure Alzheimer's is on the cusp of being finished, called 89. Unfortunately, that information still doesn't answer the question, and with the front desk lady refusing to give any call history to anyone who's not a cop, Yagami and Hoshino decide to take a field trip down to the center to get some answers. Revisiting the ADDC causes Yagami to flash back to when he was gathering evidence for Okubo's initial case, where he met Okubo's girlfriend Emi, whose passionate defense ended up playing a pivotal part in proving his innocence right before she died. As Yagami conks back into present day, he spots Kido and asks him if he can find out who Shintani called. Kido gets back to them saying that it was Shono, the unremarkable looking doctor standing next to him. Just as they get that information, Kuroiwa busts into the room looking to bring Yagami in for some questioning. But due to this being a voluntary questioning, Yagami refuses his request, which causes all kinds of trouble, eventually leading to Kido kicking them all out. Not wanting to leave without getting any more information, Yagami and Hoshino, with the help of Shono's assistant, make their way to Shono, where they're almost immediately interrupted by the Vice Ministry of Health, Ichinose. Despite Ichinose threatening to call the Japanese equivalent of the Better Business Bureau on him, Yagami asks Shono what Shintani talked to him about, to which Shono states that he wasn't even present when his phone sounded off. The line of questioning continues on long enough for Kido to arrive and kick them both out again, leaving them with nothing, or so Hoshino thinks. Thanks to an earlier conversation with Ayabe, Yagami has heard the Vice Ministry of Health come up before when he was asking him about Kajihiro's goal in shipping the Kure clan up to Kamurocho, in which Ayabe states that Kajihiro was planning some kind of huge redevelopment where he'd have to schmooze over the government and the Ministry of Health. Too many things are beginning to overlap, so they call in the resident Kajihiro expert to fill him in on the blank spots. While the info Sugiura found may be a bunch of rumors, a lot of dots start to connect with them in place, as he explains that Kajihiro's redevelopment project was for the ADDC and the area around it too. But since the ADDC is managed by the Ministry of Health, Kajihiro had to get in good standings with them to get his ball rolling. Yagami questions if getting one official is enough to tear the ADDC down, to which Sugiura explains that since the ADDC has been underperforming to meet the demands of Japan's aging population, it was already on the chopping block to get shut down. But then, out of nowhere, Kido pulls out his 89 research, and because of the potential benefit of this new drug, it flushed Kajihiro's chances of buying the ADDC down the drain. Yagami then asks Sugiura how he managed to find all this out since he only asked him earlier today, to which Sugiura states that he got all this info from a paper posted online, with the author being Hattori, a journalist that smeared Yagami's name when Okubo got charged for Emi's death. Despite Yagami's hesitation, Sugiura manages to convince him otherwise, seeing as it's their only lead, and it's a good thing he did too, as he managed to catch his not-girlfriend Mafiu leaving Genda's law office, to which Sugiura tells him that he just spotted thugs tailing behind her with their numbers growing by the minute. After saving Mafiu from getting disappeared, Yagami has Sugiura follow the thugs' van to an abandoned cabaret in Kamurocho, in which he, Yagami, and Kaito raid the place looking to stomp out the thugs, only to find out that the thugs are a part of the Kure clan. After punching Shioya into a neon sign, the backbone of the Kure, Kajihiro, finally makes himself known, as he mentions that their attempt to kidnap Mafiu was purely to bring Yagami in to hire him for a job. Despite Yagami and Kaito's anger, the both of them simmer down to hear Kajihiro's request, as he wants them to look into the death of the vice director of the ADDC, Hashiki. According to Kajihiro, thanks to the Ministry of Health accepting his bribe, alongside Hashiki acting as his partner in crime, hampering the ADDC by selling a bunch of their equipment to rival companies, everything looked like it it was going their way until 89 popped up out of nowhere. The timing left Hashiki suspicious of the so-called miracle drug and tried to look into it. However, before he can get anywhere worthwhile, he was found dead in an alley after a drunken fight. After looking into some files, it turns out that Hashiki didn't just die from a drunken brawl, but he was comatose after the brawl, in which 3 weeks later, he then died. The complicated way of how this all went down leads Kaito to believe that whoever was the assailant was a pro, and purposely made him die 3 weeks later to prevent an investigation from going down where he originally beat him. This leads Yagami and Kaito to investigate the area the brawl went down in, but since it took place 6 months ago, they can't find any evidence worth looking into. Instead, they turn their attention to a hostess club Hashiki was in hours before his death. And thanks to Sayori going undercover, they managed to find out that on the day Hashiki was murdered, he brought Shono along with him, wanting to grill him for information on 89. But shortly after they left the club, a man in a black coat approached Hashiki as Shono rode off in a taxi. Yagami presumes that the man in the black coat was the mole, and murdering Hashiki was his first job. But unfortunately, he doesn't have the time to follow up on that, as Kuroyo arrives again to deliver a message to him, telling Yagami to pay a visit to the prosecution office to see if he's innocent. Despite Yagami getting ready to fight for his life, it turns out that his innocence was only a cover-up so that they could arrest Ayabe, as forensics managed to find a bullet in Shitani's body with the markings of his gun on it. Yagami doesn't buy it, seeing as Ayabe has too much to lose by being sloppy and using his own gun, so he decides to help him prove his innocence by gathering information for him. According to Ayabe, when they last met in Tender, he was knocked out shortly after he left, and woke up in Children's Park with his gun in its holster and all the bullets still there. With nothing left to go off of, Yagami decides to go after Hamura, believing that if they can pin him down, he'll lead them right to the mole. However, Matsugane stands firmly against this, as despite not agreeing with Hamura's methods, he's the only person holding the Matsugane family above water. So he gets the entire Matsugane family, Higashi included, to stop Yagami and Kaito, but it's to no avail, as their combined might is too strong for the family, allowing them to continue on with their investigation. Eventually, they find Hamura in an underground gambling parlor, to which, after clearing the place out, they manage to get some information out of him thanks to paying attention to Hamura's facial expressions. Yagami then realizes that the one true person behind any of this was the person Shintani and Hashiki tried to call before they died, Shono. To which, when Yagami connects the dots, Hamura almost confirms it by wearing a defeated look on his face. Just as Yagami comes to that conclusion, the Matsugane arrive to bomb the place, allowing Hamura to escape for the time being. Fortunately, with that information, alongside a passing comment Hattori makes on 89, saying that he wishes they would move into human testing, Yagami starts wondering if the reason the mole's victims have their eyes gouged out is because human testing for 89 has already begun, and it causes some kind of horrific ocular side effect that needs to be covered up. Yagami brings this theory to the others, which initially gets a bunch of pushback from them, seeing as it sounds too convenient, but everything starts to come together when Kaito states that all this must have started with Waku's death. While Yagami is ready to jump on this new trail, Sugiura asks him if he truly believes that Okubo wasn't the culprit, as if he doesn't, then they're just wasting their time, which prompts Yagami to pay Okubo a visit, to which, when he tells him this theory, he responds in frustration, saying that if he just called the cops instead of burying the body, he wouldn't be stuck in jail now. With that response, Yagami believes that he's innocent of the Waku case, but refuses to believe a word he says about Emi, leaving the prison shortly after. Knowing now who really is the culprit, Yagami and Sugiura pay Shono a visit by masquerading as guards to infiltrate the ADDC. While there, Sugiura, my brother in Christ, tells Yagami that Emi's death may have come at the hands of Shono, seeing as the cops still haven't found Waku's killer. Sugiura then goes on to say that Shono could have taken matters into his own hands by breaking into Okubo's apartment, drugging him, and killing Emi, all in an attempt to make the court think that they made a mistake and that Okubo was the killer all along. After the two punch their way through doctors, they finally drag Shono into the same room where he killed Waku in, as they then hit him with a barrage of accusations. While Shono tries to act oblivious to their claims, he would eventually slip up when Yagami asks him if he knows about the mole, to which, when he responds yes, Yagami finds it odd, seeing as he's supposed to be super busy on 89, so much so that he wouldn't know a murderer by a nickname that Yagami himself gave. It's not long after that Kido enters the room looking to see what's going on, to which Yagami makes it clear that they know about the human experimentation, which prompts Kido to give the exact same scared look Shono had on his face, letting them know that they're on the right track. From here, it becomes a mad dash for evidence, as with Yagami tipping his hand, the countdown clock towards Okubo's death has sped up thanks to Ichinose's interference. With that, Yagami and the gang decide to go after Hamura instead of the mole, seeing as he's the only member of the enemy's outfit they've been able to touch. However, things take a turn for the worse when Hamura finds them first, holding both Higashi and Matsugane at gunpoint as other members of the Matsugane surround them. Kaito's honor ends up flaring up at the worst times, as he calls out Hamura for pointing a gun to Matsugane's head, only to get himself shot for his troubles. Thankfully, Sugiyura manages to sneak into the party and rescue Yagami before the same thing can happen to him, as the two then escape and later regroup to take on Hamura in the most Jackie Chan inspired fight scene I think I've ever seen in these games. After knocking Hamura's teeth in and retrieving Kaito, Yagami and Matsugane himself take Hamura to the Kyorei clan for questioning, where thanks to Shioya's added influence, Hamura starts squealing about everything he knows. Hamura starts things off by explaining the mole's skills, saying that he was once a student of a master informant until the cops busted the master, leaving the mole to his own devices. In time, the mole would surpass the master, managing to get his hands on all kinds of information and weapons a criminal can only dream of, and with Hamura becoming the captain of the Matsugane, he quickly realized that the highest paying jobs were linked to dead bodies, so when the mole became ready to start doing hits, they really began to rake in the dough. Their first hit was on Hashiki, which was ordered by a strange man named Ishimatsu. At the time, Hamura didn't think much of it and just did the job, but a few months later, Ishimatsu returned with another job offer, this one to gather and dispose test subjects for 89. No matter how many bills they waved in his face, Hamura wouldn't accept this job as he could smell something fishy was going on as he tried to scare Ishimatsu into giving him an answer. But Ishimatsu states that he's just a messenger, so killing him would do nothing but send off a bunch of alarms that would have the man who's really on top of all this use the same money, if not more, to hunt down Hamura. Ishimatsu's words manage to frighten Hamura as he backs down, which causes Ichinose, Kido, and Shono to fill in the room to formally ask him to help out with the research for 89. Due to the request of Shono wanting to get back at Kajihiro for trying to shut down the ADDC, Hamura and the mole would target Kyorei clan members. However, shortly after, they would start traveling in pairs to prevent themselves from getting plucked off the street. As a result, Hamura needed to get the ball rolling somehow, causing him to drag in that Kyorei clan member from the beginning of the game. Unfortunately, due to Hamura's nerves getting to him while he was in prison, it would also cost Shintani his life, as he told him that if things go south, to investigate Shono at the ADDC. Despite things actually turning out well for him, Shintani would still end up making that call to Shono, which caused Ichinose to order Hamura to take him out, forcing him to pay out of pocket for the whole thing too. Once Yagami asks all the questions he can, something goes bump outside the room, to which when they all leave to investigate what that was, they find Murase with a bomb strapped to his chest. The damage thankfully didn't hit anyone else or leave any entrails, but Shioya is understandably pissed at losing one of his men, so he gathers the rest of the Kyorei clan to take the fight to the invaders. Yagami and Matsugane decide to follow suit, holding Hamura at gunpoint, only to find out that it's the Matsugane men causing this destruction, setting the whole building on fire in the search for their captain. After managing to beat a path to the bottom floor, more Matsugane men gather in the entrance of the building. However, in the darkness, the mole approaches and readies his gun at his new target, Hamura. The mole takes 3 shots at Hamura, but they're all body blocked by Matsugane, and with his death, his men decide to attack the mole with very disastrous results. Thanks to the fire eating away at the building's stability, the mole misses his chance to kill Hamura, instead deciding to make his leave and take some lies on his way out. Despite the flames, Yagami and Hamura decide to stay in the building to be with Matsugane in his final moments. Hamura tries to tell Matsugane that he didn't have to do this, but Matsugane takes the time to apologize to Hamura, saying that thanks to him selling him the dream of one day becoming a high-ranking family, he put him down the path to get mixed up with murders. He then tells Hamura that he wanted to make up for all the burden he put on him, saying that he only did what a father would have. He then turns his attention to Yagami, telling him to get out while he still can, but Yagami decides to pull Matsugane's body out of the building while Hamura makes his leave. However, just before he goes, Hamura tells Yagami that the mole is Kuroiwa, disappearing into the night shortly after that. Something I wanted to bring mention to that's been a part of the RGG games for a long while now are how a character's primary colors represent their personality. The most obvious example of this is Kiryu, who dons a gray suit, which represents that, on the surface, he's a boring, straightforward man, but has a red dress shirt underneath, which tells that he has a passion in his heart for all the people he cares about, which we see time and time again throughout the series. With that in mind, it becomes easy to deduce that Yagami's colors, at least with his black jacket, represents that he is a man who has been eaten alive by lies, doubt, and the nature of Kamurocho itself. The man goes far beyond the call of duty when it comes to doing his job, holding people at gunpoint, blackmailing them, kidnapping people, just to name a few of the things he does. However, all of his actions are to bring about justice, represented by his plain white t-shirt, and his passion for justice is the driving force behind all of his actions, no matter how scuffed they may be. While I could point out a ton of other obvious color coordinations, one that currently has my interest is Hamura's, who shares the same color scheme as Nishikiyama. In a sense, the two have the same goal of trying to become dragons and work their way up the criminal food chain. But not only is it a cool callback to the previous games, his color scheme is also supposed to contrast how Kamurocho affected him from Yagami. For instance, instead of being eaten alive by Kamurocho, Hamura embraced its seedy nature until it corrupted his heart, represented by his black shirt. But even if the corruption runs so deep that it's in the very core of his being, even Hamura can't hide his emotions and pretend to be heartless, represented by his white suit, which we see here when Hamura realizes that all his scheming was for naught as a cost in the life of Matsugane. Considering how deep we are into the game, it's safe to say that Hamura doesn't get a lot of moments like this, but this one section of the game does a lot for his character, making him into a believable human instead of a mustache twirling villain that he was for a majority of the game. After coming out of the building, Kiryu then approaches Yagami wanting to bring him in for questioning about the fire, but once the two get down to the station, Yagami tells him that he knows he's the mole. Kiryu tries to play it cool, but the more Yagami speaks, the more he gets under his skin, eventually saying that when he gets out, his ass is his, which gets Kiryu to break his facade, responding in anger. Kiryu then explains that thanks to working for the ADDC, it grants him complete immunity to the law, as the people who are interested in protecting 89's progress will do anything to keep it from falling through, saying that Hamura is a loose end he'll need to tie up, and then shortly after, Yagami will suffer the same fate, letting him go after that. With the clock ticking down to Okubo's death, the team need to act fast, so they get the Master of Disguise Sayori to infiltrate Kito's office to get some dirt on him. Fortunately, Sayori doesn't need to act hard, as Kito is a horn dog who's almost off his leash, as they manage to get footage of him grabbing her butt without her consent. Not long after that, Yagami contacts Kito with the footage, telling him to meet at the batting cages in Kamurocho. However, Kito didn't come alone, as he brought a posse of Ministry of Health thugs to force them to delete the video. But, as per usual, Yagami and his friends manage to deal with the riffraff, as they then kidnap Kito, move him to Charles, and strip him of his clothes? Okay. Yagami then wastes no time in interrogating Kito, as he manages to get out of him that Shono had tricked him into signing onto 89 by telling him that he only needed his name to push it past a couple official checkpoints. It was only after a press conference where they announced 89 to the world that Shono had told him the truth, as he wanted Kito's name on the project so that now he'd work just as hard to make sure it come to fruition. As Kito continues, he mentions that Shono framed Okubo for Emi's death to get the cops to stop looking for Waku's killer, which, oddly enough, causes Sugiura to fly off the handle for a brief moment. As the questioning continues, Kito makes it clear that Shono was the man spearheading most of the operation, as when Kito thought they should hold off on going public with clinical trials as failure could bring them right to the area they were looking to avoid, Shono said that they shouldn't fear failure, as a result bringing in as many secret test subjects as he could, eventually getting the help of Hamura and Koroiwa. Kito then mentions something about Shono's secret lab, which is somewhere in Kamurocho, although he's not sure of the location, causing Yagami and Sugiura to find and tail Ishimatsu, as Kaito forced Kito to make a call to the hired hand to get him on some wild goose chase regarding the secrecy of the lab. Once at the secret lab, Yagami anticipates something going screwy considering how far up the political food chain 89 goes, and asks Mafu to call the police for him and send them over to his address. With that out of the way, Yagami and Sugiura raid the place, fighting through a bunch of homeless men acting as the guard for the secret lab. When they eventually find Shono, Yagami tells Sugiura to start recording the place for evidence. However, shortly after he asks him to do that, he notices his partner acting odd. Before Sugiura does anything, he explains to Yagami that he's been lying to him the whole time, as Sugiura was never his name, nor was he ever working for Kajihira, as he then reveals that his name is Fumiya Terasawa, Emi's younger brother. Sugiura is then stopped short of stabbing Shono thanks to the cops arriving. However, instead of arresting him for attempted murder, the head prosecutor, Morita, lets him go without even a slap on the wrist, saying that no crime was committed here. Yagami then tries to explain the situation to him, saying that this is where the Kure men end up when Koroiwa gets to them, but yet again, again, Morita turns a blind eye. Thankfully, Yakumi's got one last trick up his sleeve, which is to get himself arrested for trespassing, turning the whole room into a crime scene. Despite Yagumi's attempts to get him to play by the book, he can't get Morita to budge, not even when Ichinose steps into the room and admits right in front of them that this is a secret 89 testing lab with human blood all over it. Yagami then asks Ichinose how long he had Morita eating out of his pocket, to which Ichinose responds by saying 89 has many influential supporters and its momentum can't be stopped. But as Yagami leaves, he states that he won't let him win this easy, and in response, Ichinose tells him that he just got a call from Kido saying that Kuroiwa sends his regards. This causes Yagami to run back to Charles to find Kaito and Higashi sprawled out on the floor, as thanks to Kuroiwa and a blackjack, he was able to take them both on without so much as getting a scratch on himself. It's a low moment for everyone, but Yagami takes the time to ask Sugiura why he felt the need to lie to him in the first place, to which he states it's because he caught wind of Hamura's case and heard that Yagami had a hand to play in achieving his innocence. Not wanting Yagami to make a comeback, at least not without acknowledging his past mistakes, he made his way out to Kamurocho to make sure he didn't forget. But after interacting with him, he sees now that Yagami practically burned his failure into his memory. Now that he's worked with Yagami, Sugiura is grateful to have found the truth, but he quickly begins spiraling as he's at a complete loss on what to do next, since the enforcers of the law are protecting Shono all the while he breaks it. In the midst of Sugiura's spiral, Yagami then states that when Emi died, he'd stopped seeking out the truth as he was worried that he caused Emi's death. He then continues on by saying that he believes that to a certain extent, everyone has something that they want to hide from, but states that knowing the truth is the only way forward, attributing that to being the real reason why Sugiura wanted to meet him in the first place. And as such, they're going to chase down the truth even if it's in vain, blazing a path forward even if all the roads are blocked. And after delivering that speech, Mafuyu calls Yagami needing some bodyguards as she noticed more men tailing her and ducked inside of Tender. Once Yagami and Kaito reach the bar, Mafuyu states that clearly something fishy was going on with Morita, pointing out that the way he acted tonight was not his normal MO. As such, she's arranged for his past record to be dropped off at Children's Park to find out what's going on, but shortly after making the call, she felt like she was followed and ducked inside the bar looking to get some help. With that, Yagami and Kaito do their best to look cool for their lady friend, all the while she pep talks them as they bust heads. As they reach the taxi, the detective from the beginning of the game makes an appearance to give Mafuyu a file on Morita, which inside holds information on his past, telling of how Alzheimer's costed in the lives of both his mother and brother, the latter of whom reached a breaking point after taking care of her for so long that he ended up taking both of their lives. Mafuyu is moved by the file, saying she understands why Morita did what he did, but Yagami does everything but spit at the sob story, as he can't understand how a man can turn a blind eye to multiple lives being lost for the eventual promise of a cure. Something I really like about this scene is how Yagami stands his ground and doesn't let sympathy try and overpower him. Now, by no means was the sympathy that Mafuyu was feeling for Morita bad at all. In fact, it's actually pretty normal for you to feel bad for your fellow man when something bad happens to them. But it's letting those emotions rule you is where trouble starts to occur. This is something that Yagami brings to Morita himself, as the next day he's found cleaning out Ayabe's secret gambling hall, Lamont, and Yagami lays into him asking if more needless deaths are exactly what his family would have wanted. But then, Kuroiwa interrupts the conversation, having a bone to pick with Yagami, to which he then tells the head prosecutor to look the other way since he's so good at it. Despite Kaito also being in the room, Yagami wants this to be a one-on-one, thanks to Kuroiwa being responsible for Matsukane's death. And so the two go at it, in a surprising rival fight where Kuroiwa starts springboarding off the walls to hit Yagami. However, all the fun and games are brought to a standstill when Kuroiwa pulls out his gun, causing Morita to step in and force the detective to put his gun away, saying that his protection has its limits. With the fight over, Yagami and Kaito head topside to see that not only do they have the backing of Higashi and the Matsugane, but Genda, Sayori, the detective guy, and Hoshino too. However, in the distance, a man in a black raincoat stares at them, and with Kuroiwa still inside the building, it leaves Yagami curious as to who he is, causing him to give chase as he follows him onto the roof of the batting cages where he reveals his identity. We then cut to 1 month later where, after mulling it over a bit, Yagami decides to become Ayabe's lawyer, and with the help of the prosecution attorney Izumida, who agreed to help Yagami achieve justice by calling Ichinose to the stand under the pretense that he'll be explaining what 89 is and why Shintani tried to call Shono, and let Yagami run the show from there. After Izumida does his part, Yagami slams Ichinose with statement after statement, making the court aware of his methods of picking Kyorei members off the street. However, without any solid proof, it all seems to just be baseless accusations. We then flash back to a month ago where the man in the raincoat turns out to be Hamura, who's here to help Yagami secure his victory over the ADDC by providing his phone with a recording of Ichinose ordering both him and Kuroiwa to kill Shintani. Ichinose then tries to worm his way out of it, saying that the audio could have easily been fabricated, but that's when Yagami calls Hamura to the stand, who corroborates the story. This is the first massive blow to Ichinose, and he doesn't take it well, as he orders his lapdog to give the order to kill Kuroiwa, hoping to bury any connections he has to him. With no time to lose, Kaito, Higashi, Sugiura, and Yagami head out to Kamurocho to stop the murderer from being murdered, leaving the role of attorney to the inexperienced Hoshino, which, after a supportive smile from Sayori, he's ready to continue. As the four move into Kamurocho, they find that Kuroiwa already knows of Ichinose's plan to snuff him out, as evidenced by the bloody bodies littering the floor, to which when Yagami asks one of the conscious men where Kuroiwa went, the bloody man states that he bolted to the ADDC looking to destroy 89 and all the people who worked on it. While Sugiura thinks this is a win-win situation, Yagami explains that if Shono kicks the bucket, their chances of freeing Okubo go up along with him, so they need to act as his bodyguard, at least until they can get a confession. On the way to the hospital, Yagami asks Mafu once again to call the police and tell them to be on the lookout for Kuroiwa heading to the ADDC. But once they get to the hospital, it turns out that Kuroiwa was one step ahead of them and gathered his own branch of officers to stall Yagami and his friends as he worked his way through the hospital. After leaving the fighting to Kaito and Higashi, Yagami and Sugiura chase down Kuroiwa, only for him to blow up the bridge leading to the ADDC with his pursuers on it. While the two manage to dodge the explosion, the fall rocks Yagami in particular, who gets his back slammed by a passing car, which then proceeds to send him flying headfirst into the pavement. While Yagami is good enough to fight off a handful of hospital guards, he quickly starts feeling the damage as his vision gets impaired and he slows down immensely. However, despite all of this, Yagami presses onwards to face Kuroiwa, all the while seeing phantoms of the past here in the ADDC. From Okubo finding Waku's body to Shintani lecturing him about what smart lawyers do in a no-win scenario. But as he gets closer to Waku's room, he sees Emi, who asks him to protect Okubo and her brother. Sugiura then walks back into the room, saying that he heard Emi's voice and wanted to know if Yagami heard it too, to which Yagami states that he'll tell him about it when they're done. Within that one conversation, Yagami manages to shake off the literal head trauma he got and darts after Kuroiwa, only to find that he's already gotten the Shono. Yagami tells Kuroiwa to put the gun down, seeing as revenge is pointless now that his secret's out, but Kuroiwa laughs, saying that he's not interested in revenge as he wants to take Shono with him. Soon after stating that, cops pile into the room, causing Kuroiwa to shoot them, and in the commotion, Yagami, Sugiura, and Shono duck inside one of the labs, narrowly dodging a hail of bullets Kuroiwa peppered them with, although some of them managed to dodge better than others, as Sugiura ended up getting hit in the stomach, causing Yagami to draw Kuroiwa's fire until he runs out of bullets. With no more shots to keep Yagami at bay, Kuroiwa states that as long as 89 exists, he'll never stop fighting, to which he then transitions into exposition mode, stating that so long as 89 has the promise of curing Alzheimer's, both he and Shono have a high chance of walking out of this as heroes. Yagami calls him insane, to which Kuroiwa then tells Yagami he'll be their next test subject, starting their final fight. And after Yagami ends up tossing Kuroiwa out of a window, the madman climbs his way back into the building and hits himself with some kind of drug, starting the second round, to which he then loses anyways. With Kuroiwa defeated, Kaito and Higashi come in with some cops who somehow manage to get them to agree not to put him in jail, as they all raise their guns at Kuroiwa instead. However, in the far side of the room, Sugiura lets Yagami know that Shono is moving towards him, to which when Kuroiwa tries to take advantage of the situation by killing the doctor, Kaito stops him cold by throwing a chair at him, telling the cops that just yelling freeze isn't going to do anything. When Kuroiwa gets back up and tries again, the cops actually take Kaito's advice and start blasting him to an unnecessary degree, leaving Kuroiwa to bleed out on the floor. In his final moments, Kuroiwa tells Shono that the game is over, to which Shono agrees, saying that he no longer needs him anymore, revealing a syringe with the completed 89 formula. Shono states that there's no mistaking it this time, as he's finally created a miracle drug, but Yagami asks just how many people had to die for this so-called miracle. Shono answers him by saying 89 will save millions across the globe, which gets under Yagami's skin, as he asks if that's the reason why he murdered an innocent woman and sent a good man to die in his place. Shono breaks the facade, saying that he never wanted to kill anyone, but it was the only way to save everyone, finally getting the confession they needed, which Sugiura manages to record on his phone. And Shono decides to prove it to Yagami by injecting himself with 89, all the while explaining how Alzheimer's took the lives of his ailing grandparents and left his mother so exhausted from taking care of them that she died along with them. Shortly after the injection of 89, Shono breaks down in pain, as Kido, who ended up agreeing to testify against Ichinose after hearing Hamuro's recording, states that Shono admitted to him that he refuses to call 89 a failure, as he can't have the 7 lives it costs to make it be in vain. Kido then explains to the court that, upon injection, the subject goes through intense pain localized in the head, as their eyes become filled with a dark blue pigment. The eyes turn colors thanks to the toxins found in 89, which upon discovery would have been a clear sign of human experimentation. So as a result, Shono took matters into his own hands and gouged their eyes out, only needing them all to be the delivery boy and the garbage man. With all that out in the open, everything falls peacefully into place as Ayabe is cleared of suspicion and freed from jail. The video Sugiura took of Shono helped free Okubo from death row. Hoshino kind of gets with Sayori, all the while Ichinose and Morita get arrested for their crimes. Yep. Everything seems to be going smoothly, until Kaito brings up the possibility of Yagami going back to being a lawyer, even going so far as to say that if he wants to go back, he's fine with it, seeing as they hardly have any work, with Mafu acting as his backup. They try to tell Yagami that going back to being a lawyer may be a part of God's plan, but Yagami pulls the Uno reverse card on them, saying that you can never really tell where your choices in life will take you. However, no matter how good or bad the result is, what's important is your follow through and having the will to never give up. As thanks to leaving Genda's, it set him on the path of proving Okubo's innocence, which to him sounds way more in tune with God's plan than what his friends were speaking. Yagami also states that he didn't like wearing a suit again, to which he gives an imaginary point towards being a detective, saying that they don't have to wear suits. In the middle of their conversation, Kaito picks up an incoming call from a potential client asking if they can help her find her missing cat. Kaito doesn't want to give her the time of day, but Yagami states that this is right up his alley and takes the case as the two spend the whole credit sequence looking for the cat as it wanders by their office, ending the game. This credit sequence has no right to be as charming as it is, but man, I smile every time I see these two dorks being given the runaround by a cat. And that was Judgment, a fantastic spiritual successor to the Yakuza games that also doubles amazingly well as its own standalone title. While obviously working off the experience of past Yakuza games, Judgment provides an experience that's totally unique to itself. The way it handles the above ground politics and tackles a self-justified mentality is so interesting, and the way that it has its cast of scumbags dance around the law is so delightfully infuriating that it makes you want to see justice get served even harder as the stakes ramp up. And man, as far as protagonist goes, Yagami was the perfect vehicle to help sell the narrative, as once the guilt fades, you can feel the white-hot intensity of justice radiate off of him, which helps the aforementioned one of justice even more. The combat, on the other hand, could have used a bit more time in the oven, at least concerning the Crane style, and the Keihin gang never needed to exist, but all in all, it was still an amazing time. Now, alongside Zero, the RGG, for lack of a better term, universe, has 3, technically 4, good entry points for newcomers to play with. But there's another one to cover, and we'll be talking about it next, whenever that video can be finished. So for now, if you haven't seen any of my other Yakuza retrospectives, I got a playlist here for you to watch. Or if you're looking for something a bit different, I made an entire retrospective series on 2D Metroid games that you can watch as well. Until then, well, I'll see you all then.